The lights over the desert. The desert was a quiet thing at night, save for the wind whispering through the sagebrush and the occasional yip of a coyote far off under the stars. The air was so dry it cracked the lips of any poor soul foolish enough to be out past sundown, and the moon hung low and pale as a tarnished coin. Sheriff Amos Creed had been making his usual rounds on horseback, lantern bobbing at his side, when he saw it. At first, he thought it was lightning, a sharp flicker on the horizon, too far off for thunder to follow. But then it came again, brighter this time, a quick burst of white fire, followed by a streak across the sky like the tail of a comet. Comets, however, didn't turn, and this one banked in the air like a hawk circling prey. Creed reined in his mare, Daisy, who gave a low, nervous whinny. "Easy, girl," he muttered, though his own throat felt tight. The light grew larger, swelling until it was nearly as bright as the midday sun. It dropped lower and lower until it vanished behind a jagged rise known to the locals as Dead Man's Gulch, a barren cut of stone and shadow where miners claimed to hear voices in the wind. For a long while after it disappeared, Creed sat still, listening. The desert had gone too quiet. The wind had stopped, the coyotes had stopped, and even Daisy stood stock still, ears twitching toward the gulch. Then came the sound, low at first, like the hum of a beehive, but swelling into a deep, thrumming vibration that seemed to roll through the ground itself. It lasted less than a minute. Then nothing. Creed swallowed hard and tugged his hat brim lower. "Ain't my business," he told himself, turning Daisy toward town. But his eyes kept darting back over his shoulder, to the spot where that light had fallen. Somewhere out there, beyond the black line of the gulch, something was moving. And though Creed didn't know it yet, by the week's end, it would walk right into Dead Man's Gulch, and into his town. Chapter 1. A Stranger Rides In. Dead Man's Gulch wasn't much of a town. A single, dusty street lined with false front buildings, a church with a cracked bell, and a saloon that made more profit off watered-down whiskey than any gold strike ever had. The people who lived there were miners, ranch hands, outlaws trying to keep their heads down, and folks too stubborn or too unlucky to move on. It was late afternoon when the stranger rode in. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky in copper and blood, and the heat shimmered off the hard-packed dirt. The few townsfolk outside stopped what they were doing to watch him pass. His horse was an odd one. Tall and thin-legged, with a hide the color of wet clay. The animal's eyes were dark and glassy, and it moved with a strange, almost weightless gait. The rider himself was wrapped in a long duster coat the color of sand, with the collar turned up high. A wide-brimmed hat cast his face into shadow, but what little could be seen was pale. Pale in a way that made him look almost unfinished. He rode straight down the middle of the street, not tipping his hat or giving so much as a nod. His gaze swept over the buildings like a man taking measure of the place, and when his eyes passed over the people staring back, they felt a cold prickle run down their spines. Inside the sheriff's office, Amos Creed had been nursing a cup of coffee gone lukewarm when he caught sight of the rider through the window. He set the cup down slowly. Strangers weren't unheard of. Dead Man's Gulch sat along a trail that led from nowhere to nowhere, but something about this one tugged at the back of his mind. The stranger pulled up outside the Silver Spur Saloon, dismounted in one fluid motion, and tied his odd-looking horse to the hitching post. His boots were dustless, Creed noticed, as if he'd just stepped out of a clean room instead of riding God knows how far through the desert. Inside the saloon, the piano player faltered mid-tune when the man walked in. Conversation died to a murmur. He moved to the bar with a slow, measured steps, as though each movement had been thought through before he made it. "Whiskey," he said, his voice low and strangely flat. The bartender, a broad-shouldered woman named Mabel, poured a glass and slid it to him. He didn't drink right away, just held it up to the light, staring at the amber liquid like it might reveal some secret. "You from around these parts?" Mabel asked, leaning on the counter. The man didn't look up. "No." Mabel raised an eyebrow but said nothing more. From the corner, a card player with too much whiskey in him and too little sense called out, "Hey, stranger. Ain't polite to skulk in without saying your name." The man turned his head slowly. His eyes, when the shadow of the hat no longer hid them, were a pale, silvery gray. They caught the lamplight like coins at the bottom of a well. "You may call me Cade," he said. Then he turned back to his drink. Sheriff Creed stepped inside just then, hat in hand. "Afternoon," he said to the room at large, but his gaze fixed on Cade. "Sheriff," Mabel greeted. Creed approached the bar. "We don't get many passers-by this time of year. You headed somewhere in particular, Mr. Cade?" Cade finally took a sip of his whiskey. His expression didn't change. I am searching. Searching for what? There was the smallest pause before he answered. Something that was lost. The way he said it made the hair on the back of Creed's neck stand up. Before the sheriff could ask more, the saloon doors banged open and young Billy Carter ran in, dust and sweat streaking his face. "Sheriff," Billy panted, there's something out by the Gulch. Big as a house, with lights." He stopped dead when he saw Cade watching him. The boy's voice trailed into silence, and his eyes went wide. Cade set his empty glass on the bar and rose. "Show me." Chapter 2. Trouble at the Saloon. Billy Carter stood frozen in the doorway, eyes flicking between Cade and Sheriff Creed like a rabbit caught between two hungry coyotes. "I said," Cade repeated, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made the room still, "show me." Billy swallowed hard. "I just came to tell the sheriff. Something's out there in the Gulch. Shiny. Big. Like a boy," Creed said gently, "take a breath. We'll get to it." He turned back to Cade. "Appreciate the concern, mister, but we don't exactly go running off into Dead Man's Gulch every time a feller sees a funny light." "Then you are a fool," Cade said, flat as a knife blade. The saloon went dead quiet again, and a few men at the card table shifted uncomfortably. Creed's jaw tensed. "Now, see, I try not to take offense quickly. But in these parts, when we call folks names, we tend to settle it out back." Cade didn't blink. "I do not settle disputes the way you do." From the back of the room, one of the miners, a barrel-chested man named Tanner Briggs, already deep in his mugs, let out a laugh. "Sounds like this feller's scared to fight." Cade turned his head slowly toward Tanner. His silvery eyes caught the lamplight again, and Tanner's smile faltered. "I am not afraid," Cade said. "I simply win by other means." That was enough to draw Tanner to his feet. "Is that so? Well, let's see them means." He stalked toward Cade, hands balled into fists. Creed stepped in between them. "Tanner, don't." It was too late. Tanner grabbed Cade by the lapels of his coat. The moment his fingers made contact, Tanner froze. His eyes went wide, his mouth working soundlessly like a fish out of water. Then he stumbled back a step, arms dropping limply to his sides. "What in hell?" Tanner gasped, but his voice was hoarse, and he collapsed into his chair like a man who'd just run 10 miles. Cade smoothed the front of his coat, unruffled. "He will recover," he said simply, then turned back to the bar and set a few silver coins down for Mabel. Creed stared at him, the hair on his arms prickling. "What did you do to him?" Cade's gaze flicked to the sheriff. "Nothing permanent." Billy, who had been watching the whole thing with his mouth hanging open, finally found his voice. "You ain't from around here, are you?" Cade didn't answer the boy. He adjusted his hat, glanced toward the door, and said, "The Gulch." "Now." Creed looked from Cade to Billy, then sighed and followed them both out. Something told him that whatever this Cade was searching for, it had found its way to Dead Man's Gulch. Chapter 3. Dead Man's Gulch. The ride out to Dead Man's Gulch took less than an hour, but the way the sun sank behind the hills and the shadows stretched long made it feel longer. Sheriff Creed rode his steady mare Daisy, Billy bounced nervously on a mule too stubborn for its own good, and Cade. Well, Cade didn't so much ride as glide. His strange, clay-colored horse barely seemed to touch the ground, its legs moving with an unnerving precision. Each time Creed glanced at it, he found himself looking away quickly, as though the shape of the thing might twist in his mind if he stared too long. The trail wound between dry ridges, dotted with stubborn cactus and scraggly mesquite. By the time they reached the Gulch, the sky had turned the color of spilled ink, and the first stars were out. Dead Man's Gulch wasn't much more than a scar in the earth, a deep, jagged ravine where the rock walls rose high and narrow. The place had earned its name after a group of miners vanished in there years back, leaving behind nothing but pickaxes and an overturned cart. Folks said you could hear their voices on the wind at night. Tonight, there was no wind. They dismounted at the rim, the earth crumbling slightly underfoot. Billy pointed with a shaky finger. "There, down in the bend, you see it?" Creed followed his gaze. At first, he thought it was just moonlight on stone. Then it shifted. No, it pulsed, throwing off a soft, bluish glow. The light seemed to seep from cracks in the rock itself. Cade stepped forward, his head tilting slightly, as if listening to something no one else could hear. "It is here," he murmured. "What is?" Creed asked. Cade didn't answer. Instead, he knelt at the edge, pressed his palm to the ground, and closed his eyes. A faint hum filled the air, growing louder until Creed felt it in his teeth. The glow below brightened. Billy took a step back. "Sheriff, I don't like this. Neither do I, Creed muttered. Without another word, Cade swung down into the gulch, moving with a fluid ease that made Creed uneasy. The sheriff tied Daisy's reins to a root and followed, keeping one hand near his revolver. Billy, cursing under his breath, brought up the rear. The deeper they went, the more the glow surrounded them. The walls of the ravine seemed to soak up the light, making it hard to tell where rock ended and brightness began. Then they rounded a bend, and Creed stopped dead in his tracks. It wasn't a rock at all. Half buried in the earth lay a shape of smooth, silvery metal, its surface unmarred despite what must have been years, decades, under sand and stone. Strange markings curled along its side, glowing faintly like embers. Cade stepped right up to it, placing both hands flat against the surface. His voice, when he spoke, was softer now. You have waited long enough. The markings flared brighter, and with a low hiss, a seam appeared in the metal. The air that rushed out smelled like rain on hot stone. Billy's eyes were wide as saucers. Sheriff, what is that? Creed's mouth was dry. I think we're about to find out. The seam widened, and something inside began to move. Chapter 4. The Sheriff's Dilemma. The seam widened with a slow, deliberate hiss, like the lid of some great iron coffin easing open. The bluish light spilled out in a wave, washing over the three of them until the shadows behind seemed darker by comparison. Creed's hand twitched toward his revolver, though some deep instinct told him a gun wouldn't do much against whatever was in there. Billy stood rooted to the spot, his mule-like stubbornness for once working against him. Cade didn't flinch. He stepped into the glow, his long coat trailing like the shadow of something that wasn't entirely human. The metal split wide enough for a man to walk through, revealing a hollow chamber within. Smooth, curved walls, and an air that shimmered faintly as though the very light had weight. In the center of that chamber lay a device. It was no larger than a saddlebag, yet its surface rippled like water. Rings of light circled its core in slow, lazy orbits, and as Creed stared, he felt. No, he remembered a sound, like the deep toll of a bell struck somewhere in the marrow of his bones. Cade knelt beside it with a reverence that seemed almost holy. You are unharmed, he murmured, his voice shifting into something different. Not English, not Spanish, but a fluid, melodic language that made the hairs on Creed's arms rise. Billy's voice cracked. Sheriff, we can't just let him take that. We don't even know what it is. Creed's jaw tightened. That's the problem, Billy. We don't know anything right now. Cade's eyes snapped toward him, catching the light in that eerie silver way. This is mine. It was stolen from me long before your kind walked these lands. Creed frowned. If it's yours, then why's it buried out here? Because, Cade said, straightening to his full height, others came. Hunters. They feared what it could do. They could not destroy it, so they hid it, and they hid me. Creed felt the air change, cooler, sharper, as if the very gulch was holding its breath. And what can it do? He asked. Cade's gaze held his for a long, still moment. Restore what is broken, or break what cannot be restored. That didn't sit right in Creed's gut. So you're telling me that thing could save lives or wipe out the whole territory? Yes. Creed's instincts, honed from years of breaking up bar fights and chasing down outlaws, screamed at him that letting Cade walk off with it could be the end of something bigger than Dead Man's Gulch. Billy must have felt it too. Sheriff, he's not telling us everything. I say we. Billy didn't get to finish. A sharp, high-pitched whistle cut through the gulch, bouncing off the stone walls. Cade's head snapped up. His voice was suddenly hard. They found me. From the rim above, shadows shifted and figures began to descend, their movements too fast, too precise to be human. Creed drew his revolver. You mind explainin' who they are? Cade's expression was grim. The hunters. And they have no interest in talking. Chapter 5. Showdown under two suns. The hunters moved like nothing Creed had ever seen. They dropped from the rim of the gulch in smooth arcs, landing without a sound despite the 20-foot drop. Their shapes were wrong, humanoid at first glance, but leaner, their limbs too long, their movements like water flowing uphill. Each wore a pale cloak that caught the blue light from Cade's craft, and their faces were hidden behind masks smooth as river stones, with no eyes or mouths, only a faint red glow where the eyes ought to be. Billy let out a strangled yelp and scrambled behind a boulder. Creed planted his boots, thumbed back the hammer of his Colt, and kept his voice low. How many? Cade didn't turn his head. 4. That is enough. Enough for what? Cade's silver eyes flashed. To kill you, or to die. The hunters fanned out in silence, each holding a weapon Creed couldn't quite make sense of. Part rifle, part tuning fork, with a faint vibration humming in the air around them. One of them stepped forward, tilting its head at Cade. A voice crackled out, metallic and cold. "Return the core. Leave the shell behind." Cade answered in that same melodic alien tongue he'd used before, but now it had an edge sharp enough to draw blood. The hunter didn't respond in words. Instead, it raised its weapon. The first shot lit the gulch like lightning. Pure white energy slammed into the dirt where Creed had been standing a half-second before. He hit the ground hard, the smell of scorched earth in his nose. Cade moved, fast, too fast. His coat flared as he reached out, and Creed swore he saw his fingers blur into something not entirely human, longer, jointed differently, as he caught the beam of light in his bare hand and twisted it, sending it arcing harmlessly into the wall. The gulch exploded into chaos. Creed fired twice, his bullets sparking uselessly off the hunter's armor. Billy, from his hiding spot, managed to throw a rock that ricocheted off one mask and earned a brief, irritated turn of its head, but nothing more. Cade was a storm. He moved between the hunters with impossible speed, each strike of his hand or kick of his boot sending them staggering. One tried to flank him, only to be hurled into the wall so hard the stone cracked. But they were fast and coordinated. One swept low, catching Cade in the side with a blast of its weapon that sent him sprawling against the metallic hull of the craft. The core flared, its rings of light spinning faster. Creed saw it then, saw how the hunter's attention shifted toward the core, even in the middle of the fight. They wanted it more than they wanted Cade dead. He made his choice. "Billy," Creed shouted, "when I say run, you run for the horses." Billy's eyes peeked over the boulder. "What about you? Just do it." The nearest hunter lunged for the core. Creed emptied the rest of his cylinder into the thing's joints, not to kill it because he knew by now bullets wouldn't, but to slow it down. It worked. Barely. Cade was on his feet again, eyes burning with a light that wasn't human. He slammed both palms into the side of the core, and for a heartbeat, the world tilted. The gulch filled with two suns. One the pale moon overhead, the other a brilliant sphere of silver light that poured from the core itself. The hunters froze mid-stride, caught in its glow. Cade's voice cut through the air. "Now, Sheriff." Creed grabbed Billy by the collar and ran. They scrambled up the gulch wall, the light burning brighter behind them, until the ground shook and a sound like the tearing of the sky rolled over them. When Creed dared to look back from the rim, the light was gone. So were the hunters, and so was Cade. Conclusion? The tracks fade into the stars. 3 days later, the gulch was just a gulch again. No glow, no hum, no trace of the silver craft except for a faint, metallic smell that the wind hadn't quite carried off. Sheriff Creed had ridden out twice to look for signs, but the sand and stone kept their secrets. Billy swore he'd seen tracks. Long, narrow impressions unlike any hoof or bootprint. But when Creed went to see for himself, they were already fading, the desert reclaiming them grain by grain. Back in town, the Silver Spur Saloon buzzed with talk. Some folks said it was miners' lanterns they'd seen that night. Others claimed it was a dust storm mixed with ball lightning. Tanner Briggs, still pale and shaky from whatever Cade had done to him, kept his mouth shut entirely. Mabel cornered Creed at the bar. "You gonna tell me what happened out there?" Creed took a long drink of his coffee before answering. "Wouldn't believe me if I did." She snorted. "Try me." He didn't, not because he thought she couldn't handle it, but because saying it out loud would make it too real, and some things a man had to keep in his head until they wore down to nothing. That night, after the saloon had gone quiet, Creed stepped outside and looked up at the stars. Somewhere out there, Cade was riding. Maybe across the desert, maybe across places Creed couldn't even name. Maybe he'd found what he was looking for. Maybe he hadn't. The sheriff tipped his hat back and let the cool night air wash over him. He'd never know for sure if Cade was a friend, a foe, or something in between. But he had a feeling their paths weren't done crossing. A streak of light cut across the black sky, bright and fast, vanishing over the horizon toward the gulch. Creed watched it until it was gone, then turned back toward the darkened street. "Safe travels, stranger," he murmured. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain on hot stone. "You've just experienced a close encounter of the weird kind. Hit like so the record shows you survived, and subscribe so we can find you again."